Hi guys, alright, I've decided I'm going to make a video. I know I've been fairly vocal on some of the forums about how I think things should function, um, but yeah, never actually made a video, so this is going to be my first video. I think I'm going to need about 2 or 3 to sort of get through what I want to discuss, which is mainly going to be pressure balancing. So getting both valves working in conjunction with each other, so you get all the advantages of a better ride and more chassis control. Okay, so the first thing I want to sort of go through is just something that I use when I first sort of look at the valving stacks to sort of interpret where I should be focusing most of my attention, and which is looking at how much oil passes through each valve. So here I obviously have a WP or damper unit out of a WP 48 AER fork, which says a 34mm body. This is the damper rod, which is 12mm, obviously 34mm piston. This is the base valve assembly, so your free piston spring, your free piston, and the base valve itself. So the first thing I usually do, and it doesn't matter if it's a shock or a fork because they all function on the same principles, I like to work out how much oil's moving through the mid valve, or the active valve, sorry, and how much oil's moving through the base valve. So how we do that is we just need to know what our mid valve area is, times it by our stroke. So in this case, our mid valve radius is 17mm, so 17mm squared times 3.14 times 300, which is our stroke. And from that, we can work out that there's 272 mils of oil that moves when this fork is fully compressed. So now we need to work out how much of that goes through the base valve, and we can do that by using the same formula, just with the rod obviously. So 6 squared times 3.14 times 300 equals 33.92 or 912 mils. So that's how much oil is going through this base valve here. So we can now use those two numbers, and we can work out how much goes through each, obviously, because now it's 238mm that passes through the mid valve, 33mm through the base valve. So that's a 7.2 to 1 ratio, mid valve to base valve. So I guess I just want to talk about the shock as well, and I think I should go over the same numbers. So with the shock, so this is the 2016 through to 2022 KTMs. So like I mentioned earlier, 145mm travel, 50mm shock body. This is actually the stock piston in it here, so one of those. 18mm shock shaft. So again, we can do the same numbers to work out how much oil is moving on full compression, and then work out from that how much oil is moving through each piston. So same thing, same formula, just the area of the main piston times the stroke. So 25 squared times 3.14 times 145, so 284 mil moving on full compression, and from that we can work out the damper rod, or the shock shaft in this case, is 18mm, so 9 squared times 3.14 times 145 is 36.879mm going through the compression adjuster. So then we can work out our total numbers through each valve. So 247.68 moving through the main piston, and yeah, like I said, 36.879 moving through the compression adjuster, and from that you can work out the same sort of ratio. So then you can again have a look at where you think you should be focusing most of your attention. So the next thing I would generally do is pull the valving apart, see what's specs, but at the same time pay particular attention to the design, basically looking for things like the design of the pistons, how the ports are, not just how the ports are, but the entrance to the ports, which plays which has a large influence on how the suspension behaves. So in this case, this is just the same piston that we have on here. So big plastic piston, huge ports on it, huge opening in as well. And the other thing you'll notice from the early generation stuff, so this is 2017 again, that we have no backup shim behind this mid-valve stack. So those shims are free to flex forever if they like, and the only thing that stops them from flexing too far is the stack stiffness. And again, same thing, we pay particular attention to the design of the base valve, how that functions, and pay particular attention to, again, the same thing on the shock. So I've lined up here, and I've personally ridden on pretty much all of these pistons in that shock. So I have a very good feel for how they all function. And the one thing that's quite often overlooked with suspension is how the piston geometry changes the suspension's character or damping profile, more importantly. So when you have something that has really high flow, so this one here I had custom machined for me, so this is back in the day when I thought high flow was better. So we took this and we just made it as big as possible. And if you have a look at this, when we stick a rebound shim on it, there's a massive port opening there, so plenty of room for oil to slip on straight through and work against our compression stack. Same thing with this stock one, but just not obviously as much flow into the ports. And then obviously you work your way up to this. This here is a stock shower piston, and you can see once we get to the Japanese stuff, it's more port restriction on the way in, more port entrance restriction. So yeah, that definitely has an influence on the damping profile. So that's the sort of stuff you look for when you pull something apart, and pay particular attention to that, because that is going to alter how you would valve it, or how you have to valve it. So that's the next sort of thing I look at. So why is piston port geometry so important to take into account when we start looking at valving? Again, it's another thing that's sort of overlooked, is pressure balancing, and the fact that we have to move oil through both valves in this relationship. So this is the shock, so 6.7 to 1, and our fork was 7.1 to 1. So I mean, we've got similar volumes of oil moving in the front and back, and at similar ratios between the active valve, the valve that's moving. In the case of the shock, it's the main piston on the end of the shock shaft, versus the passive valve, so the valve that's stationary, that deals with the volume of oil that's displaced by the rod. So in the case of a fork, it's the base valve, and in the case of the shock, it's the compression adjuster with the shim stack on that. So the reason that piston port geometry plays a large part in that is because if you dump oil through one valve far too quick, the other valve then can't keep up. We know that we need to maintain this relationship. So for every 6.71 mil of oil essentially that's passing through our active valve, we need to pass 1 mil of oil through the passive valve. So it stands to reason that when you start to look at these really high flow pistons like this one I had machined, that it doesn't matter how fast we get oil through this if we can't maintain that rate through that. And then if we start doing that, then all we essentially end up doing is losing damping. We don't produce as much force, and so then the suspension is going to travel faster. It's essentially going to be softer. So we need to really maintain that relationship, unless, and this is a big unless you are really trying to produce a very progressive damping profile, in which case it's beneficial to dump a lot of oil through the active valve. But generally speaking, progressive suspension is not where we are trying to it's not what we're trying to achieve these days. We want a linear damping profile. It's going to offer it's going to be the most beneficial in terms of chassis control. So that's what we're going to sort of get into in more depth. But yeah, really need to pay particular attention to the piston geometry, and we need to understand that you can't talk about oil flow through one valve without understanding that the quicker you move it through one, the quicker you've got to move it through the other. So, you know, these people that will, I mean, we see it all the time, people focus all their attention on the main piston and the shock, never touch the compression adjuster, and it's quite the opposite in the forks. You know, a lot of people focus all their attention on this base valve, this little valve here that's essentially passing 33 ml of oil, and then they never touch the mid. Or, you know, we have check plates on mids with high flow mid valves. Again, you know, we need these two valves to function in unison, and if they don't, then you end up with funny damping profiles, or just suspension that just doesn't feel right. You know, the quickest way to make suspension feel harsh is to dump excessive amounts of oil through the active valve, and basically essentially choke the passive valve. So that's something I like to keep in mind. So I think that's probably going to wrap up this video, because we just want to focus on the amount of oil that's flowing through each valve, you know, how we need to maintain this relationship between these two valves that are working in unison, or we're trying to make them work in unison, and how the valve geometry is crucial. I mean, these are just shims. They're basically timing gates, you know, like once they open, and then they snap close. So most of the character of the suspension is done in the piston geometry. So that's why we need to sort of pay particular attention to that. So in the next video, I'm going to talk about the pressures and what happens when we start changing things, and why that relates back to that. I keep talking about it, but the damping profile, so how the bike rides and how it feels, because yeah, personally I believe that despite all these fancy pistons and stuff, like, there's a lot of stuff in the motorcycle, or particularly in the motocross industry, that's not talked about. I mean, it's far easier to anodize something a nice shiny colour, and get plenty of people to buy it, than it is to point out the obvious. So yeah, that's it for now, I think.